This is episode 68 of the Web Platform Podcast. Welcome. On our panel today, we have Justin Ribeiro.
Hello, wonderful people.
Myself, Eric Isaacson. Hello, wonderful people. And we have some guests today talking about Ember. We have Robert and Audrey. Could you guys please just introduce yourselves, tell us what you do with Ember, if you work on the project?
I'll jump in. This is Robert Jackson. I am RWJ Blue on Twitter and GitHub. I am an Ember core team member. I work for a nice startup named Aptable. We make deploying healthcare apps and dealing with healthcare compliance in the U.S. Very straightforward and a happy path. So that's what I do.
And I'm Audrey Listochkin. I'm a developer from Ukraine, from Kiev, and I do consulting around Ember, and I also advocate Ember here at local conferences and meetups, and I also help organize some of them, like Kiev.js and others. I'm not working currently on Ember project, but we have a very, very active Russian and Ukrainian-speaking community on chats, on Gitter, and I help there daily. I help people who do Ember projects there. And yeah, I love Ember.
Now, this is our first episode about Ember. We tried to do one earlier. We weren't able to do it. And it's been like over a year. So it's kind of like scary. We had a few on React. We had a few on Angular. The community is not quite as loud, I think, as Angular's community or React. But there's a lot of good stuff in there. I've done some basic things with Ember, nothing beyond like the starter templates or anything like that. But it is interesting to me to see kind of what everyone's using out there and why you would choose Ember over another framework and kind of what is that. So for you guys, what is Ember, and can you tell us a little bit about the history of this project?
I can start probably. For me, Ember first is the community around it. So it's more like a group of like-minded people who have decided to organize around this one big code base and started building cool stuff with that. And historically, Ember is relatively new. It started in late 2011. But the roots of the framework comes from the very, very early work of Charles Jolly around trying to make his own mail client after Gmail was shipped. So the inspiration for the framework came like 10 years ago. And throughout all these years, Sprout Core first and then Ember had changed quite a lot. And today, Ember is not only a framework itself, it's also all the toolsets around it, like Ember CLI and Ember add-ons ecosystem. It plays very, very well with other frameworks. There are production deployments of Ember applications using React components inside them. There are many, many high-profile companies and projects using Ember, and many of them are open source. For example, Travis CI, if you've seen those green and red badges on GitHub, when you click on them, you see an Ember app. Wine is another popular project by Twitter that is using Ember for its web app. And Apple Music is a new kid in town. Apple Music UI is done with Ember too. And so it's been in use, but from popularity standpoint, because it's a larger framework, it has some hard time attracting new people because people are scared of the size, of the complexity. But I personally believe that Ember, as an ecosystem as a whole, is much easier to start with if you compare it to, say, Angular or React, because once you dive into Ember, you learn the whole package at the same time. And with other frameworks, you learn it bit by bit, but that means that your learning curve will be extended further. So to be proficient in Ember, you have to spend not very much time. And to be proficient in other frameworks, you have to spend a lot more. That's just my opinion and why I got interested in Ember initially.
Yeah, I think that's a great intro, great explanation. I think I completely agree. I think the key point for me with Ember is the community, the people around it. Essentially, Ember is about making combined solutions to problems that we all basically have with developing web apps, and I think that's the key. As far as the project itself, we also try very hard internally to make sure to follow Semver, to not break people's apps, and the run up. We'll be talking a little bit about the run up to 2.0 and what that meant and what the result of that was and whatnot, and we can get into some of the specific details. But the goal is clearly to make a very good happy path and provide escape hatches when you have to do non-happy things, and make sure we are able to bring all of our users along with us, and no one gets sort of left behind on old versions.
So is it like Angular in the sense that you have an Angular app or you have an Ember app, and everything is very coupled to this convention over configuration type of deal, like where it's like a lot of overhead, but you get a lot of nice stuff that goes with that? Is that the case?
Well, it depends on the definition of overhead, I guess. So yes, there's a ton of conventions, and like if you, I don't know, like use Ember CLI, and if you use the default layout structure, like you can get an app that you're able to deploy in production like within minutes. Like just Ember new, it generates a whole scaffold, builds out the entire project framework. All the build tooling is done. You don't have to touch any of that, and you can go to town directly just writing your app, like your bits.
Yeah, when people start complaining about the size of the framework, they often forget about the fact that if the size of the code that's in there is the code you don't have to write yourself. Ryan Florence, I think about a year or 2 years ago, had a great blog post about framework versus non-framework, and he was talking about the fact that if you start with the smaller, simpler libraries, you tend to build your own framework over time based on the conventions that you have established in your project. Ember gives you a lot of that automatically out of the box, and that's why, like, although the initial size might be larger, as you go on, you add very little code compared to what you would do with other products.
Okay. And like if you're using this, is there a good interop story?
Uh,
So like if you want to
web
use like React
components
components as your view layer for Ember, could you do that?
um, I think you can, and the point is that the framework has a lot of escape hatches here and there, especially around the view layer. And that means that, for example, integrating Ember into a Next.js application is possible. I've seen people doing that. Integrating React as a view, React components into Ember applications is also possible. I've seen it, and I believe DigitalOcean has some code that they're running in production that does like that, something like that.
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Now, the one thing, just to make sure that we're on the same page, the one thing you can't do today, you can't just replace Ember's baked view layer with like React. That's not a thing that we intend to support. It's just not. It's just not on the sort of happy path spectrum. It's just going to lead to pain. But you can absolutely like embed certain components. Maybe you need very specific things, like a specific section where you need need something more like React. You can definitely like just put that, make a little Ember component that just the React component lives inside, and so that's sort of the bridge to the outside world, and it should basically work pretty well.
Yeah, and it's not just the frameworks like the AAA frameworks. All the jQuery plugins that you can think of, all the like JavaScript, other libraries, say Moment.js or D3, they all work with Ember wonderfully.
Yeah, the community seems pretty involved, even though it's not necessarily as loud as some of the other communities out there, which is fine. I all the Ember developers I've met actually are pretty smart, so like there's a lot of really cool stuff that you guys are doing. I just haven't experienced that full I work in a place that uses Ember all the time. I can definitely see like in Angular they have that component, and I'm just using Angular as an example because that's the one I'm most familiar with. So if you're using like Angular 2, for instance, I could see the same idea where you still need some basic bindings, but if you're going to interop, you're going to have to add things on top of that layer. And I may be mistaken, so next time I have Pascal on, he'll probably smack me through the Hangout. But I think that that's the case as well for these other frameworks. I like Aurelia a lot because what Aurelia does is it modularizes everything so that a lot of the things you can piece together. Where if you're using something in your particular team that's really useful to you, and you don't want to get rid of that piece, it's easy to plug it into Aurelia. I don't think that Aurelia has the support of that Ember has, or Angular, or any of the others, but I think it's a great idea to have that modularization. So we haven't talked about Ember 2. So is that modularization something that's been part of Ember 2, or is it still like a large all or nothing?
So as of right now, so Ember, there's two different things. There's Ember 2, the concept, and Ember 2.0.0. And
Reality.
yeah, exactly. So the when we sat down and wrote there was an RFC that we proposed. Ember follows like an RFC process where we come up with proposals or whatever, and they'll submit an RFC pull request and sort of get community feedback on things, hopefully early in the process of design, prior to implementation. Anyways, so when we proposed the Road to 2.0 RFC, we had a grander idea of what we thought we could get done in the time frame we had. Like most developers, I personally am horrible at estimation. So we had to change some of that around, but we still
Yeah.
plan to progress through the 2.0 cycle, and move towards there. So as of right now, Ember, the emitted output of Ember itself is like a single global. However, during the 2.x cycle, we will be transitioning to straight up modules that you just import, and that lets us do things like tree shaking, so you only ship to your end clients, browser clients, the portions of Ember that you need, which lets you remove a lot of things that you may not be using in your app. Like, most apps probably don't even touch 100% of Ember, right? Most of them are probably using a subset that's 50-60%. There's a bunch of like helper methods and nice little macros and things that if you don't use, then why waste that bandwidth and ship that to the client? So that's where we're going. There's because of our process to bring along the community, make sure everything is in sync, make sure there's happy upgrade paths for everything. Some of this stuff takes some time, and we want to make sure that when we roll things out, that it's sort of well architected, so we don't have massive pain later.
And you guys' documentation is incredibly thick at this point, yes? I mean, I was looking at the transition docs from 1.x to 2.0, and they're rather fabulous, really. I mean, most people don't give you such a thick guide of actual documentation. Now, how many developers actually read that documentation, I do not know, because they're developers, and as a developer who sometimes doesn't read the documentation, I can only assume that other developers are also going, huh. But I mean, have you seen, like, do you find the community loves the documentation? Because I love good documentation myself.
Oh yeah. As a person who don't write Ember, like don't develop Ember itself, but uses Ember and helps other people using Ember, the documentation is amazing. It was, I think initially when I started poking around, it wasn't as good, but by the time of 1.0 release, there was a big push in documentation side to get it very thorough.
It's
And
definitely something other large frameworks are lacking right now.
yeah, I remember I was about to try Angular 1.0, and the documentation was for 0.9, and because of that, I couldn't start anything. Right. With Ember today, it's very easy to get started, and maybe like getting started is something that is. I know that the docs are currently being rewritten by the core team, but there is a three-layer of the documentation. Like you see the homepage and you see examples there, and they're really, really great. I once spent 40 minutes just discussing these examples with the team, and they loved it. And there are guides. Like if you're interested in several topics, certain topics, you can just go through the guide, and it's extremely dense. You can find the answer to your question in like just one line, and it will be enough for you to get by. And there is an API docs, and API docs are also great because sometimes when you hit some certain corner of the framework, inside those API docs, you would get like the whole example how this or that method could be used together with other APIs. And there are books, there are tons of videos, tons of courses, all sorts of stuff, and because of that, getting along as you progress on your Ember experience, you get the documentation helps a lot.
Yeah, I think I think one of the docs are a thing that I think basically every framework gets yelled at about. I know that I have heard how horrible the docs are in the past, and it's a thing that we can always do better at and get better at. The problem that I personally find myself having is that I once you have the depth of knowledge in a given subject, you basically are disqualified from writing good beginner docs, unless you are really, really skilled at figuring out at
So
understanding
true.
the beginner perspective. So I often have trouble personally with that sort of beginner doc stuff. But then we get into the API docs where you actually do want very detailed specifics on exactly what this thing is going to do. And I think right now we have a documentation subteam that is actively working to rewrite the guides, the tutorial, the intro stuff, the on-ramp, if you will, into Ember, and make that even better than it is today. And I think they've been doing an excellent job, and I'm definitely grateful for them stepping up and doing that stuff. And as far as like internal cross references and whatnot, we're adding links to the API docs and all that good jazz to make sure that you can if you want to jump into some depth of knowledge in a given area, you can sort of click this link and go there. A lot of that is still being fleshed out.
Now you may not know this, maybe you do, but Tilda, Yehuda Katz's company, they do they control Ember's fate, like where where everything goes, or is it totally run by the community? Because I know sometimes in the community, typically in open source, people will work on what they want, right? And so there has to be some driver. Like, are documents, like documentation, is that like something that Tilda's been pushing and paying for? Or is that something that the community has kind of risen up and said, hey, we really need good docs, let's start working on this?
Yeah, I think Tilde is a great company. They do great work. Skylight's awesome, but in general, Ember itself is very much community run. All of the core team members are on, as far as I know, on totally different companies, and we have in-person face-to-faces, and we essentially together determine what the direction are. Some of those folks are obviously more prominent than others, but yeah, very much a community-run effort. But that's not to knock tilde at all. It's just not like a sort of they're not running the show. It's very much a collaborative thing. As far as the docs go, I think the documentation sub team, as of the last probably 2 to 3 months, maybe a little bit longer, has really stepped up in doing that stuff. We prior to that, the core team tried to do like not control. That's not the right word, but tried to help and actually do all of the docs writing and the docs work, and essentially that, especially during the lead up to 2.0, that led to just not being able to to get it all updated and get it all done. Just not enough time, not enough hours in the day, that kind of thing. So the community has definitely stepped up and done that. I would say the majority of documentation contributions are community contributions, like for example, we during the ramp up to 2.0, we felt this pain of new features not being fully documented and things like that we're trying to push out, and put a full stop on that, and made a policy that, hey, we're not going to land any new features unless it's fully API docked and has guides for the beginner level and all that stuff, where applicable. I mean, obviously some features are only advanced features, but yeah, so it's very much sort of ingrained to make sure that we maintain and keep things going.
So how did you guys start talking about like okay, we want to do Ember 2 because some of the style of this code is changing. We're going into this ES6 world, and like who's driving this road to Ember? Is it Tom Dale? Is it Yehuda Katz? Or how are you guys deciding it as the community?
Well, I mean, I think many of the things are driven by different ones of the core team, right? So some of the ES6 things, like for example, the uptake of ES6 modules in Ember itself, I think we were one of the largest frameworks to do it very early. That was very heavily pushed by Yehuda during his work on the actual spec and trying to make sure the spec gets implemented. Having real feedback on those things is very useful. Others have been extremely instrumental in pushing, testing, test helpers or things. Everyone has their own like little niche and their hot button issue, and we sort of collectively put all those in a hat and figure out where things are at. And also, we're all plugged into the sort of developer ecosystem at large and see where things are going and try to sort of read the tea leaves and figure out how to best position ourselves as a framework and as a community for the next year or 2 years, 3 years, whatever the time frame is.
And 2.0 was sort of labeled the garbage collection release of things. I mean, a lot of things sort of got cleaned up in terms of sort of what 1x was sort of into 2. How was that transition? I mean, like I look at the sort of deprecation documentation, and there were a lot of things, and you sort of talked, you spoke to the fact that documentation had to be up to date. You guys are on semantic versioning, but you guys had some churn in there in terms of things that didn't go quite so smoothly. I mean, in any big release, it's bound to happen. I mean, what were some of the things that happened that you guys kind of learned from that sort of said, okay, we're going down this magical road to 2.x?
Yeah, I think in general the one thing that is obvious in retrospect was that we bit off more than we probably should have initially in like the broad spectrum of things that we can do, so we pulled back. There's a series of blog posts on the Ember.js.com/blog site where we sort of talk about what's coming, and then you'll see like this progression, like wait, that's probably not going to happen, things like that as we get closer to the deadline. We made a critical failure, and we announced features and a specific date. So we can pick one or the other, but not both, I think, in my mind now.
Who does that?
Well, apparently we did. Yes, apparently we did. But so we're learning from that. But as far as the actual sort of breakdown in compatibility and whatnot, we take those very seriously. We worked very hard, like through the 1.13 timeframe. 1.13 was the 1.13 was the last version prior to 2.0, last sort of stable version prior to 2.0. And 1.13 is actively still receiving patches, still receiving updates, and we are releasing updates as they come to make sure that people's apps are able to bridge that gap. If we still found if we found something today that was removed that we didn't deprecate properly, we will absolutely go back and release an updated 1.13 version with a good deprecation. And that's mostly what I was talking about. Like during 1.13, 1.13.0 released, and there were things that we were like, oh my goodness, we already have removed this in the next 2.0 branch. Holy crap, we should backport this deprecation and get this out there so people can use it. So like during the 2.0 development cycle, we were realizing things that we forgot during the deprecation cycle of 1.13. So we had to sort of retroactively backport deprecations, and that's the thing that personally I would say wasn't the greatest at the time, but I think in the end, like if you were just poking your head up from version like 1.12 and now you upgraded to the latest 1.13, you are in a great position to continue forward. So I think we've done well, and in our moving forward on just making that a better process next time. Many of the things we learned, for example, like how all the things we deprecated. You said there was a giant list. Much of that giant list was like resulted, for example, in my work app, I had 32,000 deprecations when I went to upgrade to 1.13. That's pretty crazy, and it was all from like 3 or 4 different deprecations that just like got spammed a bunch of times. So because that seems very painful, and those deprecations all go to my console, removing the console as a way to deal with things, we came up with a nice workflow. So there's a nice Ember CLI add-on that lets you manage deprecation warnings, and it lets you silence specific ones and work on them one at a time as you move forward. Ideally, all that tooling should have been done way before 1.13 even, but we didn't have the pain. We didn't know what we needed. Come 3.0, God forbid, whenever that happens, we will be even better fit as a community to sort of move things forward together.
Yeah, I would add to that as a person who uses Ember and who sees a lot of Ember applications in the wild, what I saw that about 10% of people had really hard time updating because they were using they were extensively using some old APIs that were deprecated. But what Ember community did really right is announcing the RFC, the vision for 2.0, which is not fully realized even today, right? Very early on, long before the beta release, long before the final release. So people were getting ready, and people were able to spend their time on transitioning away from, say, fat controllers, from object controllers, array controllers, to plane controllers, and like switching from views to components and stuff. So if the team or on any project took time to actually reading that RFC and going over the list and trying to align their code base to this, what is coming, they had pretty easy upgrade. I had one person who was very upset, but used some add-ons that were like legacy views add-on because to smooth out the upgrade. The Ember core team released 2 add-ons that backported all the features to the new Ember version, and right now I don't know anyone using them. But during the summer period, some people were using them with better versions of Ember 2.0. And the whole transition, it haven't happened overnight. It took a while, actually. The whole summer, we had releases of 2.0 betas and 1.13 updates. And that was great because you could stay on 1.13 and getting ready to 2.0. Right now, most of the people I know actually using 2.1 already.
Yeah, I know Eric Brin was really busy. He was, touring all over, doing his rock star thing where he goes in and does training for Ember the whole summer. And he finally got a vacation, which just ended. So I follow up with him about that. But it's pretty amazing that you guys are able to put so much code in there. I don't know how many commits or releases there were. Are you guys at? I mean, I saw there was a bunch of RCs. Are you guys at full production? Like this is 2.0, the real thing?
Not only are we past 2.0.0, we are past
Right.
2.1.0. So we are
Okay.
now working on the current rate. So Ember follows a 6-week release cycle, similar conceptually to Chrome, and we ship a series of betas, so one beta per week for 6 weeks, and then we ship that to final. So we've gone past, we've gotten 2.0, 2.1, and now are on our second or third beta of 2.2. I can't recall off the top of my head, but yeah.
Nice.
So onwards and upwards. The 2.1 and 2.2 cycles didn't really have a ton of new features. A lot of cleanup, a lot of working on smoothing out rough edges and things like that. But I expect 2.3 will have a few fairly large features, and we'll begin sort of that new feature development in the 2x cycle again.
Now, as far as like where I work, we use a lot of Angular, right? We use other stuff too, but it's mostly Angular. So most of our in-house people know Angular very well. What problems, like now that 2.0 is really stable, and what kind of problems does Ember solve that a group such as mine might consider switching to Ember? What does it do for us?
So, I mean, in general, Ember is solving all of the internal the sort of difficult problems, letting you add and develop your actual application concerns and domain stuff. I'm not an Angular expert, so I'm not going to try to sit and compare the two directly. I do know that for certain, one of the things that is very important to us is that the framework not get in the way of actually doing the development that you need to do.
Yeah.
And the build tooling, all of the support, the fact that sort of easy distributing of shared code and libraries, all of that has been relatively recent sort of improvements in the Ember ecosystem, maybe the last 8 months or so, and really make jumping up, like if you want a new Ember app and you want to have really smooth transitions, it's like 2 commands away, and you don't have to do any integration code. You don't have to pull the library in. You just npm install a thing, and things just work. I think that's really where we're hitting our stride and letting app developers leverage community efforts, and also help those other library maintainers. As you pull up and use something like Liquidfire, which is that animation library I mentioned. You might want to add contribute some code back, and that all sort of feeds itself.
Right. And I'm a fan of pair programming, right? Because I used to do a lot of Ruby coding, and I know that some of Ember, some of the roots with Yehuda, they come from that Ruby on Rails, methodologies, and I really like the pair programming. And there was most of the JavaScript I saw for pair programming. There wasn't a lot, but most of it was Ember, where like if you go to I forget what the app is. It's a Heroku app where you can find out who's looking to pair on certain JavaScript projects. I'll put it in the show notes, but it's really interesting. Do you guys find that if somebody new is coming on and they're like, well, we use Ember all the time here. We'd love to contribute back. We're having this problem X. I submitted this issue here. Do you guys do like pair programming for something like that?
So in general, I find it relatively difficult to write prose about code, about what, like the source of a problem, to actually write it out in paragraph form. I oftentimes offer, and very often do, multiple times a week, jump on quick hangouts or screen hero sessions with folks to help them, lead them down the path to fixing the thing, and then they can submit the PR, and I don't have to do all the work. So that absolutely is a thing I personally like to do. I know a number of us do. Also, there's a few consultancies that are specialized in Ember specifically, and they come in and help. They do audits, they do performance review, they can contribute things, and some are actually even being sponsored to work on the framework internally to add features like Fastboot, which is a server-side rendering layer, and things like that. So, and some of the initial Glimmer work also. So, so all of that is sort of part and parcel, and it comes with just the really deep community involvement and people willing to jump in and just do work.
And with with Ember too, like you talked about Glimmer a little bit. One of the things in the React community, which they really boast about, is their performance, right? Because they're using the virtual DOM, and they're able to get this performance using, for lack of a better term, like ways to get around the DOM, ways to avoid it. I don't want to say DOM hacking, but basically creating this environment that's just optimized. So it's really fast, and I think Glimmer was kind of the answer to that. Can you talk a little bit about Glimmer and performance in Ember?
Yeah, so the idea behind initially HTML bars, which was like a code name, and then ultimately Glimmer, and now coming up the Glimmer, like refactoring, large refactoring is underway right now. But the idea is basically to take the lessons we learned from React, for example, and try to figure out how to leverage them in our world, where we have much more. We have like a declarative templates, templating language. It's not just JavaScript. It's like a template language and handlebars. So we tried to take those lessons we learned and apply them here. So, for example, things like what React's doing with DOM diffing in the virtual DOM, we essentially do similar things by having individual. We call them morphs, but that doesn't really matter. We have individual objects that manage the actual underlying DOM, and they're sort of gatekeepers instead of trying to figure out, what changed in the DOM tree. Just at every level, each thing remembers its last value and just does a quick, hey, is this updated? If not, then then set content or whatever the actual behavior is, depending on what kind of thing it is, if it's an attribute or if it's a text node or something like that. But I think the goal absolutely is to pick up one of the things Ember 1.0 was not great at was some performance-related things with large lists and also like re-rendering large lists, like if you sort it or something like that. In Ember 1.13 and then continuing on to the 2x cycle, we really tried to nail that sort of re-rendering large list scenario very well, and I think we did a really good job. And now we're still actively working on a few other aspects. For example, the initial renderings time for a first render isn't quite what we want it to be, so we're actively pushing forward and doing some refactorings and doing some work there. So absolutely, we try to sort of poke our heads up, figure out what things other people are doing to work around these same. We all have the same DOM slowness problems, right? So figuring out how to move forward and get that same speed gain in Ember without changing the fundamental programming model, I think has been a very important concern.
Yeah, and it's actually exciting to see React team now talking about getting the ideas that were implemented in Glimmer and bringing them back to React. So as Ember gets faster, React will get faster too. And if some framework would come up or some library would come up with some even better ideas how to improve performance, I think every big framework would eventually end up using those ideas. Just like browsers themselves, they use the ideas about how to make JavaScript or rendering faster. Initially, like 4 or 5 years ago, all these browsers had different virtual machines, and right now they steal all the techniques from each other, and we get faster and faster JavaScript every day.
Yeah, and Ember, I know JavaScript a lot of people think is the bottleneck on mobile, but I really don't. I don't think so, to be honest. How is it with Ember on mobile? Because I know, like with Angular, typically you'll make an Angular app, it'll work on mobile, but if you want really that native performance, you'll probably use something like Ionic or a combination of Cordova and some plugins to make a native app versus like having that an app that's mobile first, always on the browser. So what's the story with the browser support for mobile on Ember?
So there is a large open source project called Discourse. It's an online forum software, and they decided to use Ember for their front end, and they did a lot of work around optimizing the Ember rendering and like the speed of Ember on Android and iOS initially, and a lot of performance-related fixes and improvements were coming from that team, say 1 year ago. But recently, Jeff Atwood, the founder of Discourse, wrote a post that was relatively popular, saying about like the performance of Android, and he was using Discourse as an example, saying that Android browsers render things much slower than they do on iOS, and execute JavaScript much slower than on iOS. And on one hand, we got bad publicity from that. People start talking about like Ember being slow on mobile. On another hand, this publicity actually kicked off some work internally on Chromium and VA teams about optimizing the code that Ember actually emits, right? And turned out that Angular 2 also has similar problems on mobile. And the work that Chrome team and VA team are doing right now will actually benefit both libraries. At the same time, Ember doesn't have anything specific to like desktop only or mobile only. When you have Ember on your team, on the page, you would get Ember would handle all the events, not only like mouse events and keyboard events, but also touch events as well. So it works with Cordova, with PhoneGap out of the box. And if you're diligent, if you're careful in you can get very good performance of Ember apps on mobile. And some people actually using it on mobile without actually feeding the performance bottlenecks that Discourse have. So there is no such thing similar to React Native for Ember at the moment, and I don't think there are active projects doing that, or active teams doing stuff around this. But it's interesting to see how it goes. Well, I personally believe that the web performance can be very close to native performance, and we probably wouldn't need doing stuff like React Native in the future.
Yeah, I can agree. I mean, it's not the JavaScript that's the problem. It's sometimes it's mostly DOM, right? And it's mostly like the interaction of animation and in the DOM. And if you use native transitions versus DOM transitions, is a totally different world. And not every client is hey, I want a native app. I just want a website that if I go on my iPhone, I can see the website and it looks fine. And then when I go to desktop, it looks good, and tablet, and it's fine. And that mobile first approach, if you do something like Ionic or Cordova in general, PhoneGap or what have you, you get to share that web view component of that versus using something like React Native, where you're using JavaScript to interface with that API. I would think that you could share more code with the web view than you would be able to with that native. But it would depend, I guess, on your client's needs.
Yeah, and it's still very common to use to use Cordova as an example, to use Cordova for like 95% of your app, and then you might use Ember for 95% of your Cordova app, and then dropping down and doing some Objective-C or whatever, Java, I guess, for Android, just to get like integration with like a camera or things like that. So that's absolutely a fairly common thing, and there's nothing stopping that from happening. It's actually very straightforward to do that integration, and there's a number of add-ons in the Ember ecosystem that make testing and building those kinds of apps very straightforward. And this also includes things like Electron or Ember.js, which aren't really mobile related, but they are still sort of targeting an alternate platform.
Yeah. And how about for Ally, for accessibility? So I mean, when I think of Ember, because of its use on discourse and everything, I think of, pretty high accessibility. I think that a lot of the components would be built with that in mind. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think but out of the box, by default, Ember has all the sort of normal support that you would expect. When you develop an app, you definitely have to continue to think about what you're doing and how you're doing it. Like the specific things that you're doing are fairly important. So the app developer is ultimately the sort of end-all be-all to make an accessible site, and how you design your DOM, your HTML, markup, and all that good jazz. But from a framework perspective, we expose all the right sort of knobs and buttons and all the things, and are actively trying to push forward. Like as I mentioned before, like we have a community-driven RFC process, and one of the RFCs is to try to figure out how to make the sort of transition in a single-page app from one area to another more accessible to like screen readers, for example. Many single-page apps fall into the trap when you route from one internal page to another one. To essentially that dynamic transition is invisible to a screen reader. They're not aware that that transition happened. So we're trying to do a lot of work there, and just make things better, not just for Ember, but on the web. Period. And I think all of the frameworks are essentially going to be working towards that same goal.
Yeah, and that's been a challenge for us too, even with Angular and with other frameworks, is getting that accessibility for single-page apps. Like a lot of our applications are built with other third parties that will use server routing. So now I'm looking at other things like having universal JavaScript or isomorphic JavaScript, whatever it's called these days. But so you get that rendering on the server in the client. But with the single-page app too, I've been experimenting with ARIA Live and different ways to determine dynamic content using ARIA, but it is very challenging for sure.
Well, I am far from an expert in accessibility in general. I know that there are many experts that do work on these problems, but I don't think it's really like a specific, like there's no golden gun. There's no very specific solution, and I think that's part of the problem. I think as web developers, period, not Ember, not React, not Angular or earlier, we need to come together and we need to find a solution to this problem and sort of solve it so that all end users, every person ever that has to either use a screen reader or develop for one, doesn't have to like make their own hacky solution.
I think as developers, we're all pretty curious and logical, and we want to solve problems, right? We want to fix stuff. We want to build stuff. So it's like if we did have that gun that was perfect, that okay, every time I'm going to use this, I think a lot of us would get bored with development.
I would just shoot myself in the foot. Like I feel like you give me some mystical thing that's going to resolve. You do this and it resolves all your problems, and then it does. I mess it up. But maybe that's just me. I like breaking things. But it is a hard problem, right? I mean, there is a reason that it hasn't sort of been solved. I mean, there are lots of people working on it to sort of make it better. I think it's gotten way better across the board. I think overall for the web, both from a mobile standpoint and a desktop standpoint. I mean, there is a lot more work that has been done recently than years past, where it was sort of a second, it was an afterthought, oh, I'll tack it on, as opposed to, wow, I really do need this. So I think that's a positive that's come out of a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Also,
I mean, there's even places that just they do desktop first, right? Well,
Yeah.
mobile is not even a consideration in some places.
Yeah. Also, speaking of accessibility, it's also a matter of educating developers. Some people don't even heard about the term. They don't know how to start working on accessibility. People haven't seen, say, VoiceOver on Mac or something like that. They haven't tried screen readers themselves. They haven't seen people using screen readers. And because of that, it's hard to even start talking about that. But recently, like Justin said, it's more a matter of automating, right, and getting a lot of that being automated. And recently, there is a big push into making tools for accessibility work, not just making like components that are accessible themselves, but giving application developers tools to help them identify where they lack in terms of accessibility, right? Ryan Florence released React Accessibility A11IY plugin. That was great. It would just run over your page and check elements for missing area role artifacts and give you very, very clean error messages saying like how you can do better in terms of accessibility. So it was an easy step similar to what Ember is doing with deprecation workflows. And since then, we have the other plugins emerged for other frameworks. There is one for Ember, which is, you can Google it, like Ember Accessibility something to something. And I believe there should be one for Angular too. So it should be easier today than it was, say, even 2 years ago.
And tooling really does set frameworks apart from other frameworks too. I mean, I think, everyone talks about, latest, greatest framework X, because it seems like there's a new JavaScript framework or, framework of choice for your platform that comes out every week. And then we discuss them for some reason because we need something to talk about, apparently, in the web development community. Yeah, it's so shiny. Look at the shiny thing. Like,
Yeah.
I must.
You can always
towards
learn
this.
something from those new ones, though, because they obviously built it because they had a problem.
Sure, but it's at the same point. You take something like Ember, right? Like Ember Inspector, like that's a tool that sets it apart from other things. Like I think that tooling is sort of key to like the maintainability and the continued growth of any particular thing, because it to some extent it's easy to have an opinion and it's easy to apply that opinion in code to solve the problem that you have. It's another thing to grow a community around an open source project that continues to go. That continues to have tools that take into account. This was deprecated. I have legacy support through version X. Here's the tooling required to do accessibility checking. Like, that's an important sort of thing. Like, I think that in the shininess of new things, we sometimes lose track or we lose sight of, oh, well, I do have to reinvent a whole bunch of things to actually make this other thing work in my workflow. Which is not to say that the other things are bad. Everyone starts somewhere, right? But at the same time, it's nice to have solid rocks of which to stand.
No, I think my point is not that we should use all of these frameworks, but that some of the ideas that are spawned in them are interesting and can be used in the larger frameworks. So
Totally.
It's something we shouldn't just ignore them, I think. And the tooling, as far as that goes, from my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think the CLI tools and stuff, that was all community-driven, right? That wasn't something that Ember said, hey, we're going to do this, right? I think that was community-driven first, and then it was put into the Ember umbrella.
Well, so initially, Ember has always had very specific conventions, right? But initially those conventions didn't really apply to project structure, physical structure. I mean, I guess if you use like Ember Rails, which probably a lot of people did, you would have that prescribed structure. But there were still a ton of apps that were developed outside of that ecosystem that didn't have that same understanding of convention at the like sort of file directory level and the building output and all that kind of stuff. And I think so Ember CLI was sort of born out of like being very tired of redoing all of this build stuff every time on every new project. It's very, very annoying. So that started out under Stefan Penner's GitHub account, and then we sort of iterated for quite a while, and then migrated it to its own top-level sort of Ember CLI org. Now there's a bunch of sub-projects and whatnot. But I think that the story is absolutely critical to the point of what makes Ember great, and that story is some developers had pain. We got together as a community to try to make that pain better and make sure that other people don't have the same pain. And I think by and large, we've done that. We have a lot of room to grow, but I think that's the key, and that's the thing. And because of solving that problem, now you can grab any off-the-shelf component and and plug it in and use it in your app basically for free. Before that, you'd have to do a lot of the wiring and glue yourself. Like you'd have to do your custom gulp build or your custom grunt build, and like embed this vendor file in this order and concatenate them and figure out how to do all that stuff. And now all that is just done. You don't have to worry about that. I think that's awesome.
And you guys got it done too, which is, this happens a lot in open source where you'll see like an issue filed and then, you look at the date when it was put out, it's like 2 years old and people haven't cleaned it up or worked on it and you're like, oh my gosh, is this ever going to be in here? But you guys felt that pain and you took care of it as a community, which is pretty awesome. I love that. So is there anything that is really core to understanding Ember 2? Like, how do people get started with it? And how can they contribute once they're comfortable with it? But I think more importantly, how do people get started with Ember if they have no understanding of, how this works?
So the Ember, guides.ember.js.com has some very specific sort of high-level, here's what templates look like, here's what components look like stuff. We're actively working on more like a get started from scratch, you have nothing and no prior knowledge sort of guide. That's still in the works. There's a bunch of books that exist out there. I can link them in the show docs. But there's a couple of books out there that are set up to help people sort of onboard, make their own first app, that kind of thing, and a whole slew of articles. We also have a really active Slack community with a few thousand people, and it's great to see people just helping. There's like a need help channel, and there's always people helping other people, and so you definitely, if you're going to learn Ember, you should definitely jump in to that Slack channel and just absorb knowledge, ask questions, get feedback.
Yeah, the Slack channel for Polymer I know is really, really awesome, where you get a lot of information. It's like, Stack Overflow but live, right? So I'm sure with thousands of people it's like that with Ember too.
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the same. It's really, really great. Now, Stack Overflow is still an awesome tool. Oftentimes, I'll help people in Slack, and I'll say, hey, wait, would you mind making a Stack Overflow for this? And then we can just put the answer in, just because it's easier for long-term searching. Slack is a great tool to use, but the history limits make it difficult to go back to something that was answered a couple of days ago and find it, just because of the quick drop-off of messages. So so it's still nice to have those question and answers online, like for posterity, for searching and whatnot. But I think the ability to just get live help, whether it be Slack or IRC or whatever, I think that is a huge selling point to any framework.
Now, if people are looking through the code and they want to contribute, do you recommend like a certain area of the code, or like if is there to-dos in the comments, or is there like issues to follow, or if people find something that is a bug that they've verified, they can do a PR? Like, what is the recommendation with the project?
So mostly there's a number of issues that we try to sort of label with good for new contributors, where it may or may not be easy, but at least it's like the path is laid out, right? It's not just like fixing typos; it's actual involved things. So that's there. Also, as you're learning, I love it when people that are learning Ember go and update the docs, because like I said before, it's hard to get that beginner perspective and know where things are sort of dropping off and being missed. So that's awesome. I think that's probably the single best place to contribute as a newcomer to the framework, or to single page apps in general, just like helping with those docs. But then as you progress through that process, you begin developing apps, and then you'll have pain points and you'll have bugs, or hopefully not bugs, but you might, and then contributing back and helping those. There's a specific Slack channel dedicated to development of Ember itself, and people jump in there and say, hey, what can I do, or how do I do this thing, and we'll help them sort of groom a PR forward and make things happen.
Yeah, I would also add that there are tons of other add-ons, third-party libraries, some things like Ember CLI, or say Liquidfire or something like that, or Ember Data, that also needs attention. And if a person works with some of these add-ons and knows the inner workings really, really well, then he or she may be very, very helpful to the community. What I love about the community is that instead of like trying to outcompete each other, people tend to search for common points, common grounds. For example, there is a big add-on called Ember CLI Deploy, and it's an add-on that helps deploying your applications to, say, S3 or like Azure or other clouds, right? And it started as a merge. It started from the talk by Vic Milia at RailsConf about how his company is doing deploys, and a couple of people started implementing that openly in the wild. And at a certain point, they decided to just merge their efforts. And instead of like having three add-ons that do some small things right and some other things wrong, we have one big add-on ecosystem that itself has some pluggable architecture and stuff. But from the day one, this add-on had a big community, like 6 core contributors. It's super great.
Yeah, I mean, it's great when you have a project like that. You know, like I know the Node community is very much like that, and the Web Components community as well. As far as I know, we're up against time, but I did want to ask a quick question about Ember components and interop with, you know, like web components in general. So,
Are we arguing about Shadow DOM now? I feel like we're about
no
to
more
argue.
Shadow DOM.
I'm going to hide in the corner, okay? You guys have fun.
Document fragments.
That's fine. I'm sorry.
We had enough of that last week. We can have a separate hangout, you and me. But
Sure,
I just want to know kind
later.
of what's the long-term plan for these, and how does it work with, you know, Ember components? Because Ember components, they have this, you know, from what I understand, there's like data bindings and all those other stuff that you know, maybe web components they can do, but it's not necessarily what they do. Like with a web component, its API is its interface, like its attributes, its properties, and its events. So there's no like, you know, binding by default unless you're using something like Polymer or whatever.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. Ember components were originally thought of as sort of following the web component spec. However, that was many years ago, and those things have changed like 3 or 4 times since then. You know, so as far as the intersection between Ember component and web component, I think is still in flux. There's active work being done on Glimmer, Glimmer refactorings and whatnot. Part of the 2.x cycle intends to introduce what we're calling angle bracket components or Glimmer components, which are essentially not using, you know, the curly syntax of handlebars, but using what looks like web component syntax for invocation. You know, and again, at that point, your API is the exposed attributes and the functions you pass and that kind of stuff, with still the added benefits of live binding and whatnot that you get with Ember by default. I'm not terribly sure how useful a non-live bound sort of thing would be in a single page app off the bat. Like essentially, you see those basically being emulated in other web component implementations. You know, so we need to figure that out. Also in Ember, one critical piece that I don't know how it fits in with the web component spec yet is the way we yield block parameters. So the calling context can yield down you know, block parameters in our case to you know, to the inside block, and that's not really a thing that's really addressed, to my knowledge, in the web component spec. You know, so we definitely need to figure that out. It solves a lot of problems in Ember, and like in actual use, it's very, very useful and important. You know, to be able to do that.
I wonder if you could use something like generators for that, because then you have that cancelability, but you also have that like where, you know, you could pause, and then when the next thing happens, you get that control.
Yeah, it's definitely possible to do. What I just think as a spec in general, it needs to be either addressed or, like, said, no, this is not a thing.
Right. Okay. So pretty much you would wrap it in an Ember component as of now, but the future is sort of, you know, debatable.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, so Ember is generally about embracing standards and following behind them, and hopefully trying to make them better as we go. So I think uh, I know that there's a few different people that are involved in Ember heavily that are also involved in the web component spec and in dealing with that stuff. And I know that we're sort of keeping an eye on the path forward for future as these things sort of solidify and various browser implementations exist or come out. One of the issues that we have to figure out is obviously we still need to support Ember 2.0 supports back to IE9, and so that's a fairly important factor as well in what we can and can't do, how far back we have to support.
Yeah, I
Did you guys
wonder
get a
how
cake
long
for
that'll
the
last
internet?
because in January, IE 8 and 9 and 10 are all being dropped by Microsoft as far as support goes, so no more security patches and all that.
Yeah, I mean we're pretty much locked in for the 2x cycle to supporting IE9 plus. The big thing for us prior to that in the 1x cycle we were supporting IE8, and I'm sure that there are still some relatively decent sized enterprise folks that need IE8 support for the time being until the security support is dropped from Microsoft. But so they may be sticking at 113. But it was very important to us to be able to like just use ES5. And that's just not possible in IE8. We can do so many things in Ember today and in Glimmer and in supporting libraries now that we can depend on ES5 being a thing. That it was way worth it.
Yes, and I hope the internet sent you guys a cake for dropping IE8 support. I can only hope that was what the internet did. If you haven't done that, internet, please do that. Send them a
I
cake.
did eat a cake, but no one sent it to me. But I didn't get any like nasty emails either, so that's positive. That's like internet giving you a cake, not getting nasty mail, right?
This is true. The internet is
Mm.
generally good at that when it comes to those things. Uh,
I think Yehuda and Tom received cake from Angular Teams when they released 1.0. I remember pictures of cake.
Yeah,
At that
there
time.
was an Ember cake at 1.0, yes, for sure. I don't remember where it came from. I didn't get to eat any cake, but I was just
Yeah,
starting at
yeah,
that
yeah.
point.
They should do like some giant Ember, mascot cake, and you guys just eat that.
Yep. Future note for the next EmberConf, Ember cake.
Amber cake.
Yes. Forget the ice sculpture, just do the cake. All right. So I think we're over time. So I appreciate you guys staying on a little bit longer. If people want to contact you guys, what's your Twitter handles? How can people find you? I think it's great that you're doing Hangouts and some pairing. So I might take advantage of that and play a little with Ember because I always love to learn new stuff.
Yeah, I'm RWJ Blue basically everywhere: Twitter, GitHub, Slack, all that stuff. You can ping me on Twitter or just jump in the Slack channel and chat. I'm generally available all the time, unfortunately, but also good. So I love helping people with issues and figuring out where we can make the framework better and where things fall down.
Careful by giving out your availability. Remember, you have contributors all over the world.
That's the beauty of open source. I can just like go to sleep. I can go play some video games if I have to.
4 a.m. Robert, where are you? I need help with this.
You said you were online.
I saw you on Slack. You should help me. Right. I'm Audrey Listochkin. I'm Listochkin at Twitter, GitHub, Slack, and also we have a very active Russian-speaking chat for Ember developers. If you speak Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, or some other similar languages, come join by. It's a lovely place. We help newcomers, and those newcomers, after a while, start helping as well. So right now we have this chain of people of different skill sets, and it's the friendliest place I've seen on the internet. So if you don't speak our languages, you should definitely go to Slack and use English there. And you can also find me there too.
Can we get that in the show notes, the
Of
Slack link
course,
for
I'll
that?
send it back.
And do you have any meetups by you guys?
Oh yeah,
that you recommend?
we don't do like Ember specific meetups, but Ember topics are always on board when we have local conferences and events. And Ukraine is a very active place development wise, and we have events in every major city every month about JavaScript. And there will be talks about Ember on the upcoming JavaScript conference in Kharkiv and other places. So if you are close by, just drop by. You don't most likely you don't need a visa to go to Ukraine. So and it's a safe place. So,
Okay, let's get some notes for those, and if you got some too, Robert, we'll put them in.
Yeah, definitely. There's a bunch of Ember meetups. We have a nice site dedicated to sort of listing all of the different Ember meetups cities, and a lot of them are on like meetup.com or something, so you can go and check out their times and whatnot.
Yeah, I think it's so important to get that face to face. Every once in a while. I know I'm kind of an introvert, so I'm usually on a podcast or something virtual, but it is nice every once in a while to get out and meet developers locally. And that's how I met some of the Ember developers here. Like we have a really talented developer, David Bashford. He runs the Mimosa project. I don't know if you guys are familiar with.
Mhm.
He's pretty active on GitHub, but Mimosa is his baby on open source. But he does a lot of Node development at his company Berico, and a lot of the developers he works with for the front end, it's pretty much all Ember. So, and that's kind of like that's like my go-to if I have questions for Ember for local people. I'm like, David, can you answer this for me? So yeah, it's really nice to get out and meet people locally and see what people are doing. All right, so I think that's it. So if you guys have questions about Ember, definitely contact our guests here. And if you want to contribute or help out or use it, learn about it, maybe you're not sure. If you want to use it, but you definitely want to play with it, try some of those tutorials, follow some blogs, and we'll put as much as we can in the resources section of our notes for everybody. So thanks. This has been episode number 68, Ember 2, and the Ember community. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
thanks.
Yes, thank